The Gangut-class battleships, also known as the Sevastopol-class, were the first dreadnoughts begun for the Imperial Russian Navy before World War I. They had a convoluted design history involving several British companies, evolving requirements, an international design competition, and foreign protests. 4 ships were ordered in 1909. 2 were named after victorious battles of Peter the Great in the Great Northern War, and the other 2 were named after battles in the Crimean War. 3 ships of the class used names of pre-dreadnought battleships of the Petropavlovsk-class lost in the Russo-Japanese War. Construction was delayed by financing problems until the Duma formally authorized the ships in 1911. They were delivered from December 1914 through January 1915, although they still needed work on the turrets and fire control systems until mid-1915. The role was to defend the mouth of the Gulf of Finland against the Germans, who never tried to enter, so the ships spent their time training and providing cover for minlaying operations. The crews participated in the general mutiny of the Baltic Fleet after the February Revolution in 1917, and joined the Bolsheviks the following year. The Russians were forced to evacuate the naval base at Helsinki after Finland became independent in December 1917. The Gangut-class ships led the first contingent of ships to Kronstadt even though the Gulf of Finland was still frozen. All of the dreadnoughts except for Petropavlovsk were laid up in October to November 1918 for lack of manpower. Poltava was severely damaged by a fire while laid up in 1919. Petropavlovsk was retained in commission to defend Kronstadt and Leningrad against the British forces supporting the White Russians, although she also helped to suppress a mutiny by the garrison of Fort Krasnaya Gorka in 1919. Her crew, and that of the Sevastopol, joined the Kronstadt Rebellion of March 1921. After it was bloodily crushed, those ships were given proper revolutionary names. The other 2 serviceable vessels were recommissioned and renamed in 1925–26 while some work was done to repair Frunze, as Poltava was now known, but the money quickly ran out for her repairs. Parizhskaya Kommuna, the former Sevastopol, was modified in 1928 to improve her sea-keeping abilities so that she could be transferred to the Black Sea Fleet, which had nothing heavier than a light cruiser available. This proved to be the first of a series of modernizations where each ship of the class was progressively reconstructed and improved. A number of proposals were made in the 1930s to rebuild Frunze to match her sisters or even as a battlecruiser by removing one turret, but these came to naught and she was hulked preparatory to scrapping. The 2 ships of the Baltic Fleet did not play a prominent role in the Winter War, but did have their anti-aircraft guns significantly increased before Operation Barbarossa in 1941. However, this did not help either ship as they attempted to provide fire support for the defenders of Leningrad. Mara had her bow blown off and Oktябrskaya Revolutsiya was badly damaged by multiple bomb hits in September. The former was sunk, but later raised and became a floating battery for the duration of the siege of Leningrad, while the latter spent over a year under repair, although this was lengthened by subsequent bomb hits while in the hands of the shipyard. Both ships bombarded German and Finnish troops so long as they remained within reach, but Oktябrskaya Revolutsiya did not venture away from Kronstadt for the duration of the war. Parizhskaya Kommuna remained in Sevastopol until forced to evacuate by advancing German troops. She made one trip to besieged Sevastopol in December 1941 and made a number of bombardments in in support of the Kerch offensive during January to March 1942. She was withdrawn from combat in April as German aerial supremacy had made it too risky to risk such a large target. Sevastopol and Oktябrskaya Revolutsiya remained on the active list after the end of the war, although little is known of their activities. Both were reclassified as school battleships in 1954 and stricken in 1956, after which they were slowly scrapped. There were several plans to reconstruct Petropavlovsk using the bow of Frunze, but they were not accepted and were formally cancelled on the 29th of June 1948. She was renamed Volkov in 1950 and served as a stationary training ship, until stricken in 1953 and subsequently broken up. Frunze was finally scrapped beginning in 1949. Design and development. After the end of the Russo-Japanese War, the Imperial Russian Navy was in a state of confusion. Its leadership, tactics and ship designs had all been cast into disrepute by its repeated defeats by the Japanese at the Battle of Tsushima, Battle of Ulsan and the Battle of the Yellow Sea. The Navy took quite some time to absorb the design lessons from the war, while the government reformed the naval ministry and forced many of its more conservative officers to retire. It conducted a design contest for a dreadnought in 1906, but the Duma refused to authorize it, preferring to spend the money on rebuilding the army. The requirements for a new class of dreadnoughts were in a state of flux during 1907, but Vickers Limited submitted a design that met the latest specifications and was very nearly accepted by the Navy for a 22,000 long-ton ship with 12 12-inch guns in triple superimposed turrets. However, rumors of a contract with Vickers raised a public outcry, as they had some problems with the armored cruiser Rurik then building in England. The Naval Ministry diffused the situation on the 30th of December 1907 by announcing an international design contest with the ship built in Russia regardless of the nationality of the winning firm. By the deadline of the 12th of March 1908, a total of 51 designs had been submitted by 13 different shipyards. The winner of the competition was a design from the German firm of Blohm Amp Voss, but the French protested that they did not want to see any of the money that they had loaned Russia to build up its defenses in German pockets. The Russians bought the design for 250,000 rubles and shelved it to placate both sides. A design by the Baltic Works had been the runner-up and was revised for the Navy's updated requirements, with a complete design to be presented by 22 March 1909. This was extended by a month to allow the Baltic Works to finalize its contract with the British firm of John Brown and Amp Company for design assistance with the hull form and machinery. The Naval General Staff believed that a speed advantage over the 21 knots German battle fleet would prove very useful in battle, as demonstrated at the Battle of Tsushima, but use of the heavy and bulky Belleville water tube boilers, as insisted upon by the engineering section of the Naval Technical Committee, would prevent the new design from exceeding 21.25 knots itself. However, after John Brown indicated that the ship's turbines could deliver 45,000 shp if supplied with enough steam, and that the hull form could reach 23 knots with 45,000 horsepower, the Naval General Staff took the opportunity to get the speed it desired by using small tube boilers. It convened a meeting of the Naval Technical Committee to discuss the issue, but packed it with engineers from the fleet who were in favor of small tube boilers, and the engineering section was outvoted. The Yarrow small tube boiler was significantly smaller and lighter than Belleville large tube boiler, but required more frequent cleaning and repair, and the horsepower dropped off more rapidly with use. The Russians did not believe that superfiring turrets offered any advantage, as they discounted the value of axial fire, believed that broadside fire was much more important, and also believed that superfiring turrets could not fire while over the lower turret because of muzzle blast interfering with the open sighting hoods in the lower turret's roof. They therefore designed the ships with a linear arrangement of turrets distributed over the length of the ship. This arrangement had several advantages because it reduced the stress on the ends of the ship, since the turrets were not concentrated at the end of the ship, increased stability because the lack of elevated turrets and barbets, improved the survivability of the ship because the magazines were separated from each other and gave a lower silhouette. Disadvantages were that the magazines had to be put in the middle of all the machinery, which required steam pipes to be run through or around them, and a lack of deck space free from blast. This greatly complicated the placement of the anti-torpedo boat guns, which ultimately had to be mounted in the hull, closer to the water than was desirable. General characteristics: the Ganguts were 180 meters long at the waterline and 181.2 meters long overall. They had a beam of 26.9 meters and a draft of 8.99 meters, 49 centimeters more than design. They were completed overweight, and the displacement was 24,800 metric tons at load, over 1,500 t more than the design displacement of 23,288 metric tons. This reduced the freeboard by about 16 inches and gave them a slight bow trim that made them very wet ships. High tensile steel was used throughout the longitudinally framed hull, with mild steel used only in areas that did not contribute to structural strength. This, plus refinements in the design process, meant that the hull was 19% lighter than that of the preceding Petropavlovsk-class pre-dreadnoughts. The hull was subdivided by 13 transverse watertight bulkheads and had a double bottom. The engine and condenser rooms were divided by 2 longitudinal bulkheads. They had 2 electrically driven rudders on the centerline, the main rudder abaft the smaller auxiliary rudder. The designed metacentric height was 1.76 meters. Propulsion 10 Parsons type steam turbines drove the 4 propellers. The engine rooms were located between turrets 3 and 4 in 3 transverse compartments. The outer compartments each had a high-pressure head and reverse turbine for each wing propeller shaft. The central engine room had 2 each low-pressure head and astern turbines, as well as 2 cruising turbines driving the 2 center shafts. The engines had a total designed output of 42,000 shaft horsepower, but they produced 52,000 shp during Poltava's full-speed trials on the 21st of November 1915 and gave a top speed of 24.1 knots. 25 Yarrow Admiralty-type small tube boilers provided steam to the engines at a designed working pressure of 17.5 atmospheres. Each boiler was fitted with Thornycroft oil sprayers for mixed oil coal burning. They were arranged in 2 groups. The forward group consisted of 2 boiler rooms in front of the second turret, the foremost of which had 3 boilers while the second one had 6. The rear group was between the second and third turrets and comprised 2 compartments, each with 8 boilers. At full load they carried 1,847.5 long tons of coal and 700 long tons of fuel oil, and that provided a range of 3,500 nautical miles at a speed of 10 knots. Armament. The main armament consisted of a dozen Obukovsky 12-inch pattern 1907 .52 caliber guns mounted in 4 electrically powered triple turrets. The guns could be depressed to -5 degrees and elevated to 25 degrees. They could be loaded at any angle between -5 degrees and +15 degrees. The rate of fire was 1 round every 30 to 40 seconds up to 15 degrees of elevation and 1 round per minute above that. The forward turret had an arc of fire of 330 degrees. The second turret had a total of 280 degrees. The third turret 310 degrees and the aft turret 300 degrees. They could elevate at 3 to 4 degrees per second and traverse at a rate of 3.2 degrees per second. 100 rounds per gun were carried at full load. The guns fired 470.9-kilogram projectiles at a muzzle velocity of 762 meters per second. This provided a maximum range of 23,230 meters. 16 manually operated 4.7-inch 50 caliber pattern 1905 guns were mounted in the hull in casemates as the secondary battery intended to defend the ship against torpedo boats. Because of the lack of freeboard and bow-heavy trim, the forward casemates were often washed out in even moderate seas. All guns had a firing arc of 125 degrees to 30 degrees and at least 4 could bear on any part of the horizon. The maximum elevation was 25 degrees and they could elevate at 3.5 degrees per second. They could traverse at 6 to 8 degrees per second. 300 rounds per gun were provided, which was increased from 245 rounds during construction. As designed, they were 15 feet above the waterline, but this was reduced in service as they were overweight. They had a rate of fire was 7 rounds per minute and a maximum range of about 16,800 yards at 25 degrees elevation with a 63.87-pound semi-armor piercing model 1911 shell at a muzzle velocity of 792.5 meters per second. The Gangut-class ships were completed with only a single 3-inch 30 caliber land-air anti-aircraft gun mounted on the quarterdeck. This had a maximum depression of 5 degrees and a maximum elevation of 65 degrees. It fired a 14.33-pound shell at a muzzle velocity of 1,929 feet per second. It had a rate of fire of 10 to 12 rounds per minute and had a maximum ceiling of 19,000 feet. Other AA guns were probably added during the course of World War I, but details are lacking, although Conway says that 4 75mm guns were added to the roofs of the end turrets during the war. 4 17.7-inch submerged torpedo tubes were mounted with 3 torpedoes for each tube. Fire control. 2 Zeiss 5-meter rangefinders were fitted on the conning towers, and there was also a 4.5-FOOT bar and amp Stroud instrument, possibly for precise station keeping on the master ship when concentrating fire. 2 Krylov stadiometers were situated in the lower level of the forward conning tower. These would provide data for the central artillery post to calculate with its imported Polinago Mark V clock, a mechanical fire control computer, and then transmit the gun commands via the Geissler transmission system for the gun crew to follow. During the winter of 1915-16, the Zeiss rangefinders were transferred to armored hoods on the rear of the fore and aft turrets, and, at some point, 18-foot bar and amp Stroud rangefinders were added to the roofs of the middle turrets. Gangut received a 9-foot Polon rangefinder in the spring of 1916. Protection. The armor protection of the Gangut-class ships had to protect against 2 different threats as revealed during the Russo-Japanese War. Japanese high-explosive shells had riddled the unarmored portions of Russian ships and had even sunk several ships with the heavy armor belts unpenetrated. The Russians decided that the entire side of their ship needed to be armored, even though this would limit the thickness of the main belt. They developed a system where the outer armor would break up or at least slow shells down and burst immediately behind the outer armor, and an inboard armor bulkhead would stop the splinters and shell fragments from reaching the vitals. This system likely would have worked against the British armor-piercing shells that performed so badly at the Battle of Jutland, but would have failed against the improved shells introduced afterwards with the redesigned fuses. A related weakness was that the turrets and conning towers lacked the inboard splinter bulkhead, even though they used armor thickness roughly equivalent to that of the main belt. The waterline belt, made of crop-cemented armor, had a maximum thickness of 225 mm, but tapered to about 150 mm on its bottom edge. It was 117.2 meters long and had a total height of 5 meters, 3.26 meters of which was above the design waterline and 1.74 meters below. However, the ship's draft was almost 50 to 79 centimeters deeper than intended, which meant that much less was above water. The remaining portion of the waterline was protected by 125 mm plates. The upper belt, which protected the casemates, was 125 mm of KCA over the citadel and 2.72 meters high. It thinned to a thickness of 75 mm forward of the citadel. The area aft of the citadel was the only unprotected section of the hull. 3.4 meters inboard of the side was a longitudinal splinter bulkhead made of Krupp non-cemented armor. It was 50 mm thick at the level of the main belt, but thin to 37.55 mm behind the upper belt. The main deck sloped from the bulkhead to the lower edge of the waterline belt and consisted of a 50 mm KNC plate on a 12 mm mild steel plate. This space was used as a coal bunker, which added extra protection. The main belt was closed off by 100 mm transverse bulkheads fore and aft, and the steering gear was protected by armor 100 to 125 mm thick. The main gun turrets had a KCA face and sides 203 mm thick with a 100 mm roof. The guns had 3-inch gun shields to protect against splinters entering the embrasures, and they were separated by splinter bulkheads. The barbets were 150 mm thick above the upper deck, but reduced to 75 mm behind other armor, except for the fore and aft barbets, which only thinned to 125 mm. The conning tower sides were 254 mm thick with a 100 mm roof. The 120 mm guns had their own individual 3-inch gun shields. The funnel uptakes were protected by 22 mm of armor. The upper deck was 37.5 mm of nickel-chrome steel, and the middle deck was 25 mm of nickel-chrome steel between the longitudinal splinter bulkheads, but thin to 19 mm outside them. The lower deck was of 12 mm mild steel. Underwater protection was minimal, as there was only a single watertight bulkhead, presumably of high tensile steel, behind the upwards extension of the double bottom. This was an extension of the splinter bulkhead and was also 3.4 meters inboard. A more comprehensive system was considered early in the design process but rejected because it would have cost them 500 to 600 T. The armor scheme of the Gangut-class ships had some significant weaknesses. The rear transverse bulkhead was unprotected by any other armor but was the same thickness as the forward bulkhead, which was defended by the upper belt armor. The thinness of the barbette armor was a serious defect which could have proved fatal in a battle, and the lack of a splinter bulkhead behind the armor of the turrets, barbets and conning towers left all of those locations vulnerable to main gun hits. But the biggest weakness was the lack of an anti-torpedo bulkhead, which made them highly vulnerable to mines or torpedoes. Construction. All 4 ships were laid down on the 16th of June 1909, but this was just a ceremonial event as actual work did not begin until September to October. One major complication was that the design for the turrets and the magazines was not completed when construction began, so the weights and dimensions had to be estimated. The machinery for these ships was built by either the Baltic Works or the Franco-Russian Works, as the new Admiralty shipyard lacked its own engine shop. Construction was initially very slow because the Duma did not allocate any money for these ships until May 1911. Initial funding was taken from other budget items of the Emperor's discretionary fund, and the shipyards had to use their own money to keep the work going. They were enormously expensive, with the cost estimated at 29.4 million rubles each, including armament. By way of comparison, the preceding class of pre-dreadnoughts had only cost 11 million rubles each. Once the Duma provided the funding, the pace of work accelerated and the ships were launched later that year. Although delays in the delivery of engines and turrets hindered the completion, all of the ships completed abbreviated trials by the end of 1914 and reached the fleet in December 1914, January 1915. Ships